All right, welcome everybody to our Introduction to PECS, Picture Exchange Communication System webinar today. I'm Daniel Parker. I'm with the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. I'm the Autism and Family Engagement Consultant. I'm joined by Ellen Franzone from CESA 6. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you.
Again, I'm Daniel Parker. I am the Autism Consultant at the Department of Public Instruction. But I'm just going to give my guest today and co-presenter Ellen Franzone a chance to just introduce herself and tell us a little bit about what you have do with students with autism as well as your relationship around PECS.
Oh, sure. My name is Ellen Franzone, and I currently work for CESA 6, and I coordinate a project that we have there that's called the Allies in Autism Education Project, where we're working with teams of educators from several different regions of the state to improve and increase their use of evidence-based practices for students on the spectrum. My background is in speech and language, and I have been trained in the PECS protocol and have used it with several students. And also I'm supporting teams now as they look to use it with students or look to improve their current use. And prior to my coming to CESA 6, I worked at the Waisman Center with the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders, which was the group that was funded by the Office of Special Education Programs that first kind of identified this group of 24 evidence-based practices. So I was a cog in the wheel there for a while, but I'm at CESA 6 now.
Thank you, Ellen, for being with us today. I should say, I myself, Daniel Parker, I've used PECS. I started using it in the late 90s through the early thousands for about 7 or 8 years when I was working with students with autism. Was trained in the PECS protocol, and it was at that time the main communication system we used for students who are nonverbal or limited verbal abilities. That was before the tablet iPad era. But in any case, we're going to talk about some evidence-based practice, do some overview of the step-by-step, and then we're going to talk about the tips and tweaks and some resources for further study today. A couple quick assumptions, and this one is a big one. That students, all students communicate in a message just providing them with success in the past. PECS is often, Ellen, as I know you would agree, a system that people use for students that have difficulty with their communication and may communicate in other means. What are some of the other ways that students may communicate typically that PECS is often used for?
Well, I think kind of where I come from it is that really as educators, it's our job to make sure that all students have access to a functional communication system, that they have a way that they are able to say what it is that they want and are able to continue to indicate that they want to continue activities or change an activity. And that it's our job, a priority job, is to teach that kind of a system to a student who may not be learning it as easily as typically developing peers or other peers with disabilities. So I think when we talk about kids on the spectrum, we often talk about kids who are exhibiting behaviors that we find challenging or behaviors that may interfere with classrooms. But I think if we really think about all of that being a way for that student to be able to communicate to us, and again, if we can shape and if we can teach that student an easier method or a more functional method, PECS is one way that you can do that.
In addition, I like talking about skillful versus unskillful behavior. So we have a lot of students who currently are getting students' attention, requesting their wants and needs in ways that are not as skillful as what they are capable of. And I should say also with that kind of presumed competence idea, and all students are able to improve in their skillful use of behavior, I have personally used PECS with students with significant intellectual disabilities in addition to autism, and have found that they have been, and it does take time and very strong training, but it does, I have seen outcomes for those students to make very basic requests for their wants and needs, and that can be a huge help in them choosing that mode of communication versus a less skillful mode such as crying or screaming or tantruming, which is another way that students have found to get what they need. So just keep in mind that this is really an intervention for many students. I'm not going to go through all the terms today. The big ones that we have talked about, the NPDCASD is the National Professional Development Center on Autism Spectrum Disorders. They're the ones that have identified PECS as an evidence-based practice, and AIM, the Autism Internet modules, the content today is kind of pulled from that AIM module, and I'll be showing you a little more about that coming soon. So if you hear us use AIM or MPDC-ASD, those are those two definitions of what those agencies are. In addition, I have some information about PECS, and we're going to be reviewing the definitions shortly. This presentation is based on the content from the AIM website, as I said, and the step-by-step instructions from the MPDC-ASD. We're basically going to define PECS, outline the steps to implement it, and provide some examples. But it is not intended to take the place of a training and resources on PECS provided the Pyramid Educational Consultants group. Pyramid is the group that created the PECS system, and because PECS is an evidence-based practice as identified by the MPDC-ASD, that is the reason I have selected it as a webinar topic, because I'm referring to those resources from MPDC and AIM and the information, and MPDC worked with the Pyramid group to develop some of that information and approve that. But I do very strongly, I know Ellen you agree, that this conversation and discussion about PECS today is not enough for someone to go out and start implementing.
Yeah, I believe very strongly that if you are hoping to implement PECS with a student, that there needs to be members of your team that have been fully trained at a formal PECS training. They are usually findable. I think Daniel has some dates here in Wisconsin that'll be coming in the coming year. But I do think that the information that we're going to be reviewing today and the information that is available for free as an online resource is a really great way for professionals who maybe have been trained previously, or and maybe it's been a while, or professionals who just kind of want to review. I think that there are some nice resources there. And then the other piece that I think is very true is that it's not many districts that would be sending every person with whom that student is going to be using their PECS communication system, or who might be supporting the student in that use, that all members of that team are able to go to that full 3-day training. So I think if you have an SLP and a special education teacher who have attended that training, and then you want to say to your paraprofessional staff, to your general education teachers, to maybe another special education teacher in the building, you say, hey, we need your help and we need some support, then this is a really nice way to kind of catch them up a little bit, get them familiar with the information. So that's how I see using both that formal training from the Pyramid company as well as these free materials online.
Great. Just to give you an idea up front, before we start talking about the definitions and everything, of what this actually looks like. So what does PECS look like? And so this is, I just have a couple pictures I'm going to blow through here kind of quickly, and these are just from online. This is kind of the traditional kind of PECS book or PECS board. So when we use the term PECS book or PECS board, that's kind of what we're talking about as we move through this. And we're also, just to give you a really quick case study, I'm going to go through kind of a summary of one of the case studies that was on the AIM Autism Internet Modules website.
Daniel, before we do that,
yeah.
Do you mind, can we go back to that second picture?
Yeah.
I just want to make the case that that picture of the PECS binder there is just, I think most people know this, but the reality is that that's not how we're going to initially introduce PECS to a student.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think we get really excited because we all of a sudden want to give kids lots of words and lots of vocabulary and give them so many opportunities. But the reality is, and you'll hear more about this as we go through, that we don't start by providing students with a whole board full or a whole book full of pictures. So we'll go into that. But this would be a student who has moved through several of the phases already.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, this student would probably have gone through, it looks like, pretty much all of the phases.
A lot of them.
Yeah, a lot of them.
Yep.
So let's kind of talk about, again, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about from beginning to end. This is just a case study, and this is from the Autism Internet Module website. And I'm going to move that along. So in this case study, and I'm going to summarize the information that was in the Google Doc folder as it kind of describes it in that case study. So it talks about Alexandria Alex, who is a girl with autism in an inclusive kindergarten classroom, and she is mostly nonverbal, but uses gestures or vocalizations to communicate her desires. Alex often waits to interact with others, and her teachers want to use PECS to teach Alex to initiate to others. Her parents were hopeful that PECS would assist Alex in developing her verbal speech in the future. So Alex's teachers talk with Alex's parents, and they do some observations to find out what objects and activity Alex enjoys. And we'll be talking as we go through this preparation. Even before you get to phase 1, there's a lot of stuff you have to do before you even start implementing PECS. And a lot of that goes with the talking with the family and finding out what the interests are of the student. Alex's teachers completes a reinforcement sampling or a preference assessment to identify which items Alex chooses most often when presented with a series of 2 alternating choices. Her teachers take pictures of these highly preferred objects, activities, and foods. Next, Alex's teachers prints out multiple copies of these pictures, so there can be a book for home and for school as well as backup pictures. In addition to preparing the PECS book, Alex's teachers prepare a second set of materials to send home one of the books along with the CD with all the pictures. Alex's teacher identifies a location in the room where 2 people can work to train Alex on how to use PECS, as well as schedule times in the day of when Alex will learn to use PECS. In phase 1 training, Alex works with 2 teachers who teach Alex the relationship between picking up a picture of one of Alex's highly desired items, handing it to a communicative partner, and receiving the requested item. Alex quickly learns how to independently pick up the picture of the desired object and hand it to the communicative partner so she can receive the desired object. So Alex is demonstrating independent initiation in this example in a request for an object, food, or activity when one PECS icon is placed in front of her. Now, in this case study, and we're going to go through all the phases when we talk about PECS, but in this specific case study, in phase 2 of training, Alex's teacher moves from the training table to another table or location in the room. So Alex must walk over to Alex's teacher to hand her the PECS symbol for what Alex wants. Alex independently began scanning the communication book, which holds the PECS symbols to find the picture of the thing she wants. Thus, her teacher did not have to implement discrimination training. So in this case study, the student was a student who had some pretty unique abilities, who previously was using nonverbal communication, but very quickly, independently started picking out additional pictures from inside the book. So it kind of went beyond what the training protocol was. And we're going to be talking specifically, walking through each step later on. So sometimes, though, in this case study, Alex would hurry and quickly grab a picture without looking at which one she chose. Her teacher always says, "You want," and the name of the object, when Alex hands her the teacher a picture. Alex was self-correcting her mistake when she hands the teacher the incorrect picture and went back and found the correct picture independently. So it's pretty awesome when you're working with a student who's self-correcting.
Yeah, I think so. And I do think that we see this when we implement PECS with kiddos, that we have some kids who move through the phases very quickly. There are some kids that I recommend it for, and I say, you're going to be moving through phases 1 and 2 within the week. Like this little guy is going to get it, and he's going to, you just know. So I think that that's actually fairly common, especially with students who maybe have some higher level cognitive skills. I think what's important, though, is that you still acknowledge where you're at in the process, and that you still, and that you don't assume that a kiddo is going to, oh, we're just going to start at phase 3, or,
no.
or we don't have to worry about that part, but really that you're taking good data, that you're watching, that you're observing, that you're being really mindful as you kind of move through those phases, even though, without question, some kids do move through them very quickly.
In phase 3 of training, Alex's teachers and students in the classroom begin acting as communicative partners and learning how to respond to Alex and provide Alex with what she requests when Alex hands them a PECS symbol. So they've started generalization here. Alex and her class and the teachers also take the PECS book to other locations in the school, such as PE, art, and music classes, so Alex can generalize her communication and initiations in those settings as well. In phase 4, Alex's teachers began working on teaching Alex to use a sentence strip. So first she was just learning how to use the pictures to request things that she wanted, and now she's using a sentence strip with an I want card with one of the pictures she already has been using to request specific objects, activities, or food. They start phase 4 with just 2 teachers, so they do not overwhelm or confuse Alex. So even though Alex was using those PECS in a lot of different environments, when they wanted to introduce a new phase, they kind of made sure to do that in a structured teaching environment. Alex's parents are disappointed. Alex has not begun to use verbalizations to say the name of the object she wants when she's pointing to the I want object. But Alex's teachers encourage the parents that Alex may learn to pair a vocalization with the pointing to the sentence strip in time.
And I can speak to that maybe a little bit if I can interrupt the case study really quickly. But I think this is a situation, you know, we SLPs hear all the time when we suggest using some kind of alternative communication system or an augmentative communication system. Families will often say, well, but I want my child to talk, or my child is already, you know, using 2 or 3 words, so why would we do that? And I think the refrain that we always come back with, which is true and grounded in science, is that to put an augmentative communication system in place for a student does not prevent that student from developing verbal language. If a child is able to develop verbal language, they absolutely will. I always say to folks, there is nothing more functional than being able to sit on the couch watching cartoons and holler to mom in the other room that you want your crackers. That is absolutely what you will be driven to do if you're able to do it. But what a PECS system or some other augmentative communication systems do is really provides that bridge. Where is that student now? What are they able to do now? Where do we want them to be? And so oftentimes these systems end up bridging that gap between kind of lower, less skillful communication and verbal communication and bridge it. And for some kids, they stay there, which is also really okay. It's okay that they have a functional communication system in place that works for them. But I just wanted to throw that out there.
Definitely. And we're going to be talking about in this phase 4, how the teachers are actively working to try to elicit some of that verbal speech. And have it coming along somewhat naturally as well, and using that communication device. So we'll be highlighting that as well. In phase 5, Alex's teacher makes a game out of what do you want, which is going to be part of phase 5, where Alex and her classmates all take turns selecting pictures from a pile or verbalizing what they want when the teacher asks, what do you want? Alex uses the I want sentence strip and selects the picture of what she wants when playing the game. So in phase 5, Alex is learning how to respond to the question, what do you want? In phase 6, and this is the last phase, Alex's teachers begin teaching Alex the difference between I want, which is requesting, and I see, which is naming. And this is hard and sometimes frustrating for Alex because she first doesn't understand that, you know, when previously she was saying I want and she was getting an object, now she's using the PECS symbols to say I see, and she doesn't get the thing when she says I see, and that can be frustrating at that phase 6. So her teachers made sure to provide Alex with many sensory movement and other preferred activities and reinforcement to help Alex learn the different meanings between I want and I see. So when Alex would respond to the I see PECS, she was given some other additional reinforcements besides the object that she was naming. And we're going to go through that phase in more detail. So in this, Alex begins to choose the correct picture out of a set of pictures when asked, what do you see? And can put this on a sentence strip with an I see and picture symbol. So she can do this for what do you see? Her teachers and family now feel Alex understands the difference between naming I see and requesting I want. And for the next steps, Alex is more ready to initiate and respond in her first grade class next year. She will continue to build vocabulary and work on pairing a verbalization with her use of picture symbols. All right. So, you know, I do that case study really quickly just to upfront give you kind of the beginning to end of one kind of situation of moving through. It's going to make a lot more sense than I'd strongly recommend. There's another case study in there as well to review those at the end of the webinar, but I just kind of walk you through kind of the beginning to end of a student before we kind of get into the discussion of kind of what this is and going into the phases. I'm going to flip through these very quick, but the National Professional Development Center, where you can get this additional information, is the location, and they have a website from the MPDC-ASD, and on there they have step-by-step instructions, implementation checklists, and there's a series of other evidence-based practices there. Ellen, you just told me that they added a couple evidence-based practices to their website.
They did. They just updated the literature review, and so they had gone back into the research literature to see in the last probably 5 or 7 years what new has been shown to have an evidence base, and the 3 that they have added are modeling and scripting and exercise, as all resulting in positive outcomes for students on the spectrum.
Right. New topics for webinars. All right. It's important to note that not, again, not just because it's an evidence-based practice doesn't mean it's going to be the right evidence-based practice for every student. And I would say that is definitely true of PECS. PECS is a very specific intervention that's going to work with certain types of students with certain communicative needs, and we're going to get into that. But also make sure that even if you are using PECS, and I think we're going to be really talking a lot about this throughout, that you're really using it as the evidence base is shown, and looking at those step-by-step instructions, getting training from the people from the pyramid group to implement PECS, or getting and making sure that you're implementing the program with fidelity. Because you may have certain students, and if a certain phase is not working and students are not responding, it may be because you need more training, or there's some tips or very specific adjustments that need to be made.
I use PECS as an example all the time. When we talk about fidelity of implementation of different evidence-based practices, what we're talking about is saying, how do we know that this teaching practice needs to be used so that it lines up with what they did in the research? Because if you're not doing it essentially the way it was done in the research, then no matter what you call it, it's not necessarily evidence-based. And I think PECS, more than anything else, and most of us know this, I think, we call a lot of different things PECS. That word is thrown around. You have a little 2x2 board maker picture, and people are calling the pictures themselves PECS. So I think we use that phrase a lot, but what Daniel kind of walked through in the case study, and what we'll be talking about when we look at step-by-step directions, is that it really is a very methodical protocol, moving through different phases, that is grounded in principles of applied behavior analysis, or ABA. So I know when I was an SLP that first went to my first PECS training, I was shocked. I sat in the room and thought, I had no idea. What are you talking about? I had no idea that this is what I've been calling PECS should actually look like this. And so I think it is really important. This is what, and maybe it's because I'm an SLP, but this is one that kind of gets under my skin a little bit, that we need to kind of spread the word that anything involving pictures isn't PECS.
Definitely. And then that's just a screenshot of the AIM Autism Internet Module website, where you can sign up for a free account. They have additional case studies, activities, documents that go along with their modules. They have many modules in addition to the MPDC-ASD modules that they have on there, and the PECS module is one of those MPDC-ASD modules. But I would highly recommend going to the AIM for additional resources and information. To set the stage, I actually had to revise this slide today. 1 in 68 children have some form of autism, according to the most recent Center for Disease Control. So we are seeing more and more students diagnosed with medical diagnosis of autism, and also seeing an increase in students with eligibility in the education world. And it's important just to keep in mind that some of the characteristics of people with autism is the communication abilities. And if you met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Just keep that in mind. So really be thinking about specific students when you're engaging in any evidence-based practice. I have 2 slides that I show for all my webinars, and considering students' basic needs, and just to kind of see where this fits in. Certainly access to communication systems. This PECS definitely fits that kind of need. I really feel strongly that students need access to some sort of communication system, as Ellen was saying previously. I would say also it's always important, and I know the PECS creators in their trainings that I went to, they try to keep it very fun, exciting, engaging with the student. There's a lot about knowing the student, knowing student preferences that goes along with this. So having a strong relationship with caregivers is definitely applicable to this PECS intervention. So let's get into it and talk about PECS. This is the definition from the MPDC-ASD, and as you can see, PECS is a system that was developed, and it's a communication system. It has 6 phases. And sometimes I always ask for the elevator speech for certain evidence-based practices, but I almost think the PECS, one of the things we talk about is that really how you define it is so important. You can't just call a picture symbol or a visual schedule a PEC.
Right, absolutely. And like I said, I think we're going to be going through those steps later today. But I think if you want my elevator speech on why PECS is such a tremendously useful program for many of our kids, is that I don't know any other system that is out there for teaching communication that teaches students from the very beginning how to initiate communication, how to do so in a very unprompted manner, how to seek out a communicative partner. There are many steps in those early phases of PECS that we lose with our kiddos because we start over-prompting them. We start kind of telling them, like, where's your book? Where are your pictures? Go get your iPad, and kind of walking them through so that all of those prompts become wrapped up into what communication is. And PECS doesn't do that. And so I think it is invaluable as far as spontaneous initiations and attention getting. I think it is just a fabulous program for that.
In addition, PECS is an example of an aided, augmentative, or alternative communication system. So similar to sign language, picture boards, speech generating devices. I know, Ellen, you were going to make some comments around the difference or similarities between PECS and other speech generating devices.
Right. So I think right now, certainly in the field, many of us are seeing kids get iPads or other tablets, but mostly iPads, provided to them and in their hands. And so in years past, there were certainly speech-generating devices that were out there, but they were harder to get. They were more expensive. They're more expensive. I mean, that's really the big piece. They were more expensive. You had to go usually to a specialty clinic. Insurance was involved, and there was a lot to it. Whereas now, iPads are being used so ubiquitously, especially by kids on the spectrum, for lots of different things. And so it's starting to be like, well, why wouldn't we just go directly to a speech-generating device or an app that allows for a speech-generating device? And so I have a couple thoughts on that. And one is I think that's a fabulous thing, right? I think that in general, the idea that we are making alternative communication modalities easier to obtain, less stigmatizing, cooler, more functional, all of that is a really great thing. And at the same time, we run into that same thing that I was just talking about, which is, yeah, how do we teach this kiddo to use this? How do we teach them to use it without embedding ourselves as adults into that routine and making them dependent on our prompts? And so that's when I go back to PECS, and I'll talk a little bit, I think, a little bit later, too, about kind of how I've seen some teams starting to overlap some of those processes using a PECS protocol or steps from PECS in the introduction of a speech-generating app on their iPad, things like that. So those are just some thoughts. So I do think that those two camps are merging a little bit, and I think there are things to be learned and gained from both sides. But I also think, we can't throw PECS out with the bathwater or whatever, because there's a lot of good there.
So part of defining PECS maybe is that it is a process for instruction, would you say?
I think certainly, yeah. I mean, I think certainly that PECS is a way that you can teach. And I don't know that the PECS people would agree that you can always use kind of an electronic tablet in that same capacity, but I do think there's maybe some room for thought.
There's some pieces of it,
absolutely,
for sure.
Sure.
Yeah. And again, by my meaning of it being a process is getting away from it being a bunch of picture symbols that are used as visual supports.
Right. I think many of us know, right, that people somehow think that we put a communication system in the hands of a student and wham, bam, they can communicate now, and that's just not how it works. Right?
Well, Bondi and Frost, who are the co-creators of PECS, this is kind of their definition, is a behaviorally based intervention that teaches the learner to use visual graphic symbols to communicate with others. So that's a nice summary, I think, of what PECS is. So let's watch. I am showing a couple videos today from an introduction to PECS, which is from the Pyramid Educational Consultants, and this is their introductory video, and it's a few minutes long, and you'll just kind of get a little bit more see it in action types of examples here.
Another alternative method is picture systems. Traditionally, these systems require the child to point to a picture. This strategy eliminates the need to teach the child to imitate. However, pointing is not helpful if the child doesn't have the adult's attention, or taps at more than one picture, or touches a picture while looking out the window. In this case, we don't really know what the child wants. One effective communication solution for these children, parents and teachers, is the Picture Exchange Communication System, or PECS.
I want orange candy. Good job, Kat.
At the time we started PECS, we had very, very limited communication available with Mike because in addition to his lack of oral speech, he also had fine motor abnormalities that were going to limit his ability to ever have sign that was understandable to people who didn't know his personal signs. So we were very relieved to find a system that provided that kind of universal ability to communicate, and even more, that immediately gave the child that knowledge of the power of communication, the motivation to communicate, and what that was going to do for him.
I need help. Help.
PECS does not require a long training period on the part of parents, teachers, or children. It encourages communication in a social setting initiated by the child. Rather than building towards spontaneity, PECS begins with spontaneous actions.
When children learn PECS and learn to be able to control getting their most important reinforcers, we see lots of the frustration diminish. So we see far fewer tantrums and outrageous behavior because the children do have a relatively simple, easy way to get the most important things around them.
While many traditional communication lessons begin by teaching the child to name objects, a far more useful skill for students to learn is to request items that are highly reinforcing.
All right. So that gives you a little bit of an example of an introduction, a different kind of introduction there. And if you want to see the research base, there's a really nice summary on the MPDCASD website. So we've talked already about why we like PECS, so we'll probably move through this pretty quickly. One of the things that that I like is, we often are really searching for interventions for our nonverbal or limited verbal students. So this is a big one for many of those students. In addition, that physical action, so you saw those students actually taking a picture symbol off of a board and handing it to a person, and there's a different type of interaction there than what you might have with other types of augmentative communication processes. And so those are a couple things that I've kind of thought in terms of my liking of this program. And I think it helps to make it a little bit more concrete. It's certainly, PECS has been even easier to do with video iPhone cameras and digital cameras and Google Images and all of these things. Finding pictures, I don't know if you remember back in the day if you used PECS where you would have to print out these big things and cut out pictures, and yeah, so it's a little easier today, so that's a nice thing. And then when you look at later phases of PECS, there is some pieces around sentence structure and understanding of some of those pieces as well. Would there be anything you want to add to those why we like PECS that we haven't already mentioned?
Sounds pretty good.
All right. So Ellen brought up the iPad. So what about the iPad or tablets? And so why should we even be considering using PECS in this day and age? And we definitely want to say that iPads and other tablet devices and augmentative communication devices are fantastic. The student has a device that is working to communicate. That is the most important thing. One of the things that I feel in terms of younger students, sometimes for younger students who are learning communication, it can help with understanding kind of that concrete interaction a little better of handing a communicative partner an exchange. So I think there's actually a little bit more concrete exchange. I think for some students who are younger manipulating electronic device, I've heard that often with people. I've gotten calls from the field of people who say, well, we have an iPad, but the student really struggles in being able to use it, even for leisure, you know, just even for games or anything. So this might be an alternative system for those students.
I think so, certainly. And actually, I always think that it's remarkable how many kids can activate those iPads and use them very functionally. But I do think some students do struggle with the idea that when the iPad is used for reinforcement, when the iPad is used for gaming or for leisure activities, and then to have to switch it back over to using it as a communication device, that is certainly a conversation that is out there in the field right now. How do we handle that, for sure?
And one more that's not on here that, as I was developing this presentation that really rang true, is that later on in the phases, they teach a difference between wanting something and naming something, and they have some very nice strategic protocols for how to teach students to spontaneously name objects around them or to comment on things. And that is a huge opening door skill for participation in classrooms.
Absolutely. That idea of being able to expand on different communicative functions, I think, is huge. PECS absolutely does start with requesting, and for our students on the spectrum, I'm of the belief that really is, because it's highly reinforcing. If you say, I want something, and you get something back, gosh, communication is awfully powerful then. So I am great with that, but I do also appreciate that in later phases, PECS does try to expand exactly that to commenting, right? I see a bird, I see the bluebird, right? Or I see my teacher, those kinds of different ways that we use language in a more social way.
In addition, and again, this kind of gets about the definition of PECS, we just want to remind people that, you know, when we're talking about PECS, we're not talking about it as a visual supportive visual schedule. Sometimes people use the PECS symbol icons, those picture symbols, for visual schedules, and that's okay. You can use the same picture. One of the things that I would say be careful about, because it could be confusing to the student, if a student has a PECS book and you take their picture symbol from their PECS book and take it off their PECS book and then put it on a visual schedule, you're taking something that's a communication device and using it for a visual support and for planning. And that, at times I've heard from people in the field, that can upset a student, that can cause some confusion. And it's not that you can't have multiple pictures of a koosh ball or of a trampoline or of a teacher and use them for visual supports and use them in the PECS book, but you want to make sure that there's an understanding these are two different systems.
Absolutely, and I think that a visual schedule and a PECS book are both communication systems. The thing we need to remember, though, is a visual schedule is how we communicate to that student. That visual schedule is us telling the student, this is how it's going to go. This is what's happening right now. This is what you're doing now. This is what's coming next. So it's our communication to the student. That PECS book is simply a way for that student to communicate to us. So that's kind of how I talk about it. It's all about communication, but it's a little bit of kind of who's doing the talking.
All right. So for students with autism, you know, PECS does teach basic communication and interactions, is clear and concrete, which is very helpful. A lot of students have difficulty with understanding these cause and effect outcomes of when I do this, this will happen, and needing some constant repetition in that area, so there's a lot of repetition with the PECS protocol. It definitely is used to help students learn more skillful ways of expressing their communications for their wants and needs. Some resources to implement, coming back to training. Although any professional parent or caregiver may use PECS procedures, it's recommended that those interested in doing so receive professional training. Mm-hmm. And here's the website for the Pyramid Consulting Group who do PECS introductory trainings. They actually have some in Wisconsin, and at the end of the PowerPoint presentation, there's some resources with the dates for that as well. In addition, what we're going to talk about, a reinforcement inventory, or sometimes people use different words, reinforcement inventory, reinforcement sampling, preference assessments, but basically you have to be, reinforcement sampling is a specific protocol which we'll discuss specifically how that works, but you really need to find out ahead of time before you implement what the student's main interests are, the highest preferred interests, and that could be toys, books, activities, food, drink, yep, etc. Yep. And then also thinking of number of pictures, again, as Ellen said, there is very strict protocol on how you start PECS. So you're not just creating a whole bunch of pictures and spreading them around the room and trying to start teaching the student incidentally what things mean and picking up things. That is not the PECS protocol. Right. Mm-hmm. All right. Another piece to keep in mind, and we're not going to get into this too much, but one of the just kind of tips and tweaks, the forms of representation. Some students, one thing to consider, and this is part of your assessment up front, some students may not be at the picture level of identifying things. So, you know, there can be some intensive adjustments where you actually use tiny three-dimensional objects for the PECS.
Or not so tiny. You know, I mean,
yeah,
you know, like the cookie box or the can of Pringles, or right, a representation of a swing by kind of the strap that the student holds onto or whatnot. So I think that's another kind of individualized programming thing that sometimes we lose sight of. We just kind of want to go to those 2x2 board maker picks because that's what we have, and we have created 8 gagillion of them, and we have a really fancy like organization system that we use to keep track of them all, but we really need to think about each individual kid, and if an actual object is something that they need to be able to manipulate, if they would do better with a photograph of that object, if they need kind of a color line drawing, or if they might need a black, or if they're able to handle a black and white drawing. So again, your SLP and I think your special ed staff can come together and really look at what we know about that student, look at the data, look at things that we've tried, what has worked and what hasn't worked, and make the decision as far as what's most appropriate.
A little tip someone told me for students that need that object representation, mm-hmm, and if you have little tiny little objects that can represent larger objects, yep, like a little tiny ball that's three-dimensional, yep, that represents, mm-hmm, a larger, yep, ball, they can take those ice cube trays and they put them in ice cube trays and they fill them with some type of resin, oh, and then they pop them out, and that way they're all the same kind of shape and size, and they actually can then easily be Velcroed to the PECS strips and things like that. So I thought that was kind of a creative little tip and tweak. Every time I get a chance to throw that one out there, I do. So, so settings to use PECS. In the Autism Internet modules, you will find the PECS module under Home, Community, Workplace, and School settings. So there's, there is also, research in those areas as well that PECS has been shown to be effective across settings. So let's get into the nitty-gritty and start talking about the steps for implementation. Again, these come from the MPDCASD. These are just some screenshots of where the following information comes from. I pretty much have taken this information exactly out of it. Because PECS is such a specific protocol, I wanted to be as close as I could to the MPDCASD, who I know had worked with the Pyramid Group in developing those step-by-step instructions.
Before we dive into the steps, do we want to see if anyone has questions?
Yeah.
Are we able to do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
That might be a good time.
So at this time, if you could go ahead and type in any questions you have so far about the PECS process. We're going to take a quick, just 20-second break as well. All right, if you're typing in some information, we had a couple comments about review. Here's one question. What do you suggest for a student who is not at the picture level and who does not show clear interest in any food activities or toys?
Mm-hmm. So I think those kids that are really hard to find highly reinforcing activities for are kids that we are all really challenged by. I always say that I think we can find something that reinforces individual kids, but it can be hard. And sometimes I think we think about it like we're giving in. So I think sometimes those kids are kids who have, who are really interested in individual things, and people might call it fixated on certain things. And sometimes those are the things that we might want to use to help get communication out of a student. So I think really thinking outside the box, thinking about kind of sensory-based activities, turning a fan on that student's face, splashing in some water.
Some of the things we did was, and I don't know, you got to think developmentally appropriate and age appropriate too, and setting, but bubbles was certainly one. So taking the lid off of bubble and blowing bubbles. Certainly small quantities, and I always recommend, definitely talking to the family and finding out what does that child go to at home. If you're able to, maybe doing some home observations to see that. If the parents, if you and have permission to do that, just finding really fun, motivating, often things that are quickly accessible is best as well. So if you have to take a 10-minute walk to get to the place, that's not always the best place to start, but
or just start there in the first place.
Or start there. And that's another thing. Go to a different environment. Maybe there's is there a time of the day the student really enjoys? Does the student have a sensory room? And maybe there's things in the sensory room. And again, like Ellen said, the purpose of getting started and focusing on these preferences we'll talk about is getting the student to start communicating using the system. And you're going to do that by starting with their interests. All right, fantastic. All right, so let's get into some of these steps. So the setting up time. So setting up, and prior to even starting phase 1, there's a few things that are required here. So you're going to be looking at how students are currently making requests, types of directions student responds to, looking at how the student's transitions. Is the student already requesting and initiating? How are they doing that, et cetera? Do you have anything to add in terms of what information from the speech and language assessment ahead of time you would be looking at?
Sure. I think kind of opening up your mindset when we say how is a student currently making requests, a lot of times for our kids on the spectrum, we'll see them either get it themselves, right? They go to the cabinet, they open the cabinet, and they pull out what they want, or they do some of those leading behaviors where they take your hand and place your hand on what they want. So those are two common ways that we see kiddos who maybe aren't using verbal skills as readily are making requests.
In addition, and this is going to be the big one, is that reinforcement sampling, and that's the process and procedure in the PECS protocol. So you're really observing part of that is observation, observing the student and talking to family and doing reinforcement inventories. Sometimes they're called reinforcement inventories. But there's also a specific protocol for the sampling. So really, once you identify what you think the student likes, there's actually a way to test it. And this might also answer that previous participant's question. So we're going to kind of walk you through what that reinforcement sampling looks like.
And I'm going to chime in to say that I love this process. I love this process. The PECS people spell it out very well. And I often refer folks to just this pre-teaching setup, this idea of how to do a reinforcement sampling for lots of, even if they're not looking at doing PECS, but they're looking at, right, I can't find anything that this kid wants to work for. I don't know what they're interested in. I'll say, why don't you look at some of these resources from PECS and try this reinforcement sampling. And it is, as crazy as it sounds, it is just get a whole pile of stuff and to go through it and see what that kiddo reaches for. And they're kind of fun to do, frankly. And so, this process and the way they spell it out in the tools, I think, is very strong.
And as Ellen said, you kind of just take two of what you think are going to be high preference objects, or if you're not sure and taking a best guess, you just put them in front of that student, and the student's going to reach out and take one of them, and you record that, and you take data on which choice they made. It is important not to provide verbal directions because you don't want to influence their choice in any way. So you're just laying it out in front of them, and they're just going to it themselves and picking those things up. You want to make sure that you give them a chance to enjoy the object for an appropriate amount of time, and that's going to look different maybe for different learners and different students. And if you are choosing to use food, my big recommendation, use small samples. You're not putting out a plate of cookies. You are putting out, a tiny little piece of one. And with food, again, I would encourage making sure good communication with families and the whole team, making sure there's nothing wrong with using food in sampling. And if you're using reinforcement sampling, often food is something that all people want, and people have very strong preferences. It's human nature. And if you can capitalize that to help a student communicate more skillfully, then it's definitely a powerful tool in the toolbox.
Yes. I reinforce myself with food all the time.
Yes. So this is kind of my, so if you wanted to try reinforcement sampling, you put a koosh ball and a tennis ball in front of a student to see which one the student might prefer more. Let's say the student chose one of them. One of the things that the protocol requires is that you then put them out again, but put them out in a different presentation. So they were right to left, and then they switched left to right. And that's just because some students at certain developmental levels, they just reach out and grab whatever's in front of them and pick it up. So you want to make sure that they're not just grabbing what's in front of them, that they're actually grabbing what they desire. So by moving objects around, forwards, backwards, left, right, that's part of the reinforcement sampling protocol.
There's an art to this, and that idea of like letting them play with it for a moment and then taking it away and offering up two new things. It is a dance that you're doing and takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you kind of get the swing of it, most kids roll with it pretty well because you're just kind of putting novel things in front of them over and over again, so they're usually pretty engaged.
So we're going to watch another little clip here, and this talks a little bit more about that pre-phase 1 when you're getting prepared for working with the students for PECS.
The first step in PECS, then, is to figure out what a child likes: food, drink, toys, books, anything that a child consistently reaches for and holds. If you don't know what a child wants, you can't begin any lesson, especially one designed to teach the child to ask for things.
Chip. Let's go with chip.
Once the child's likes have been identified, pictures of those things are made or selected. Once the desirable reinforcing items are identified and pictures of each have been chosen, PECS training can begin.
All right, so that was just a video example of them going through and talking again about you have to create those, you have to do that reinforcement sampling, collect those items, then you start taking the pictures of those, and you can find pictures online. You can use programs, you can use Google Images. I know some people prefer to take the picture of the actual object that the student is using in the room because a ball in one ball doesn't look like another ball, or those types of things. So that can be helpful. Let me see, I'm going to move along here. That was on the reinforcement. So you're going to only start with a few pictures, remember, starting out. So if you do create a whole bunch of pictures, you want to make sure that when we get into phase 1, the protocol is only going to require you to be laying out one picture of the object. So one at a time. So
you can have gobs of pictures.
Sure.
And be kind of enticing the student with different objects, but one at a time. One at a time. Yep.
And Frost and Bondi recommends keeping all of these pictures in 3-ring binders with Velcro strips, the magic of Velcro, placed on the cover and inside laminated pages. So Ellen talked about, we showed a picture of a PECS binder at the beginning that was kind of like for a student that was well into the phases. This would be an example of a student starting out.
That's right. You're just going to put one picture on the front cover there. Yep.
This is just a picture of inside the binder. This is just another screenshot. This is an interesting one. I just Google imaged some of these, to be honest with you, and it was interesting because this is a nice modification because I know some students the plane at which they view things can make a difference in their ability to comprehend and communicate. So that's a nice modification for some students, just to keep in mind. All right. So, you know, printing these pictures, it is a good idea. I would say, even though you're only going to start teaching with a few pictures, go ahead and make a bunch so you have them, because as we know, people get busy and you might only have that one day to do them, so make a lot of extra copies. Eventually you'll be able to share these as backups or for homeschool or for different environments. They get lost, etc. One of the suggestions in the internet modules was around making a backup CD of all the pictures as well and providing a copy for home.
Oh, a backup CD that dates those modules already.
Yeah, I think I put in the presentation or Google Doc, or Dropbox or electronic file sharing would probably be the easiest thing. Yeah. All right, so you're going to want to make sure that you're doing some scheduling here, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Yep. So this is kind of the big whammy. This is the part where folks just kind of lose it. When you start phase 1 with a student, that is 2 adults on 1 student. It is the truth. It is what it is, and there's no kind of getting around it. Because to teach that student to initiate grabbing that picture and handing it over, and that's the beauty of PECS, right? Because in doing that exchange and handing it and placing it in somebody's hand, we are really teaching dialogue. And we are really teaching that student that communication involves 2 people. And just pointing at a picture in a book in an empty room isn't going to get you what you want. You got to get somebody else involved. So in phase 1, it is 2 teachers with 1 student. And so you do have to be a little bit formal about it. And you need to set up times and arrange times. So you say during speech and language, is there a way that the paraprofessional can come to the speech room so that we can work on PECS? Certainly snack time is the time where all of us, or lunch, many of us are using our PECS books and practicing PECS. And so you have to be creative. Families can come in and help sometimes, but you do need 2 people, because 1 person is going to be the communicative partner. 1 person is going to be there kind of keeping all those goods and making the world awesome because they've got the bubbles. And then the other person is going to be sitting behind the student and physically helping that student with the exchange without saying a word. So doing some of that hand-over-hand prompting from behind and then gradually pulling back from that.
It's also a good idea to be thinking in advance of where you're going to be using PECS when you start generalization, because if you have a student who's moving through the phases fairly quickly, you want to know what other teachers are we going to do this with. Talk to those teachers in advance that this is the program we're going to be doing, and at some point I'm going to be coming to you, and this is what it's going to look like. Talking with the family, thinking of good peer models that could be communicative partners for the student. So the more you can do that up front so that you're prepared and have a plan, the better you're going to be going forward. So let's talk about phase 1. And in phase 1, the goal is for the learner to look at a picture symbol, reach for that picture symbol, pick up the picture symbol, and hand the picture symbol to a communicative partner. And as Ellen said, this requires 2 people. 1 person is the communicative partner. That's the person the student is handing the picture to and is receiving something from, and having the communicative exchange and the dialogue. The other person, the other teacher, is the helper. And that's the language that was used in the MPDC ASD step-by-step instructions. And that helper is next to or behind that student and is doing some guidance and helping that student learn how to pick it up and hand it over. So let's take a quick look at, so those are the definitions right there, the communicative partner and the facilitator. I kind of had some fun with PowerPoint. So if you were thinking about this, you have your helper teacher. So that's my helper teacher. They're behind or next to the student. You have your student. You're going to have the picture of the object. You want to make sure that desired object is in view, and then you have the communicative partner. Pretty cool, huh?
And what that facilitator often is going to do, that student is going to reach for the object. So that's what's going to happen. That student, you've got something there that you know they really, really want. That student is going to reach their hand for that koosh ball, and that facilitator is going to change that reach for the picture. So when that student goes for the actual object, that facilitator is going to guide that student to actually reach for the picture, exchange, and get it right away.
Yep.
Yep.
And that's just another little visual. We actually are going to show a video of that guidance here from the Introduction to PECS from the Pyramid Group. It should be noted that the student can be sitting or standing. So if you're having trouble with phase 1, that I would say is a key point that they outline that, you know, for some students sitting is going to work best, but for some maybe a counter and the student walking up the counter is standing. But you want to do it whatever works best. And you're, again, going back to that, you want to make sure those pictures of highly desired items is very important too. So what you were just saying is the student's going to try to reach for the desired objects in the same manner as the student reached for the object in the reinforcement sampling. So, you know, if you do the reinforcement sampling around the same time that you're doing the phase 1, not necessarily on the same day, but if you do it in the same location, I think you might increase the chances that the student's going to be reaching for those items, thinking about students and, you know, routine, etc. So that was a thought I had. And as the student reaches for that desired item, the helping teacher physically redirects the student to pick up the picture. Very important to not use verbal prompts. That is throughout. And that's probably a possible error that if you're using PECS, you might sit down with your team and consider, are you using any verbal prompts when using PECS?
We do it all the time. All you want to do is say to that kiddo, what do you want? What do you want? And it happens all the time, and it is really tricky to stop yourself. So what PECS talks about, what I talk about, is you just get to be this fabulous person who has all of these fabulous things. And if that student, if you've got gummy bears and that student wants those gummy bears, you can just be like, these gummy bears are so delicious, and you can hold the gummy bears up, and you can smell the gummy bears, and you can taste the gummy bears, and you can be having a fabulous party with those gummy bears to make it as enticing as possible. But what we don't want to do is say, tell me what you want, because again, then that becomes the routine, and the student isn't going to initiate communication until you say, tell me what you want. And so what we really want them to do is to be enticed, to be drawn in, to be interested, and then to initiate that communication on their own.
And we know many students, and I've heard people talk about kind of that thinking of the whole, that gestalt, when they learn a set of outcomes, behavior, and you know, they do this and this is the outcome, and they learn it in one environment, they're stuck in there. And a big piece of PECS is teaching spontaneous communication. They want that student to want that item. So they have to do that by reaching for it. And if they're not reaching for it, that might tell you that maybe it's not, maybe you go back to your random sampling. Maybe they just ate lunch and they don't want to do that. Maybe they're tired. Maybe, you know, whatever it is. So it has to be a spontaneous communication on that student initiating reaching out for that. So let's take a look at what this looks like, and you'll probably have a better idea of this.
Phase 1 of the training is the physically assisted exchange. No time will be spent on teaching the child prerequisite skills such as sitting or looking at the trainer. The initial setting takes advantage of the child's strong interest in the reinforcing item.
Very nice.
2 trainers are used to ensure that the child will learn to communicate spontaneously. 1 trainer is the child's communicative partner. The communicative partner sits across from the child and draws the child's attention to the initial training item. The other trainer is the physical prompter, or the trainer who will physically assist the child to engage in communicative behavior. The communicative partner draws the child's attention to the reinforcer primarily by showing the reinforcer to the child. The communicative partner does nothing else to aid the child. She does not ask questions or talk to the child. Once the child sees a favorite item, the natural response is to reach for it. This is the child's first initiation. It is at this point that the physical prompter guides this reach to what will become the communicative behavior. Picking up the picture of the favorite item, reaching toward the communicative partner, and releasing the picture into the communicative partner's hand. Once the communicative partner has the picture, she reacts as if the child has asked for the item.
Brad.
The child is given time to enjoy the item. The sequence is then repeated.
Brad.
They did talk about making sure the student is allowed to kind of enjoy for an appropriate amount of time. And you're going to do this several times. So you're going to have that. That's why it's nice to have small little pieces if you're using food, or sips if you're using drink, or limited amount of time of play for objects that the student can play with quickly and get some enjoyment out of, so that you can do, and you're really just building through repetition, the student's really learning that when they grab that picture. So one question that some people might have is, like, how long does this sometimes take for some students to learn that when they pick up this picture and hand it to somebody, that they're going to receive that item?
I have had students who get that right away, who without question engage in that, I mean, almost immediately, right? And I think we've all seen that, who just really seem to understand, and they get this, and they move very quickly through it, literally almost immediately upon being taught. And I have other students who sit at phase 1 for weeks and months. I mean, that is absolutely true. And I think for those kids who are moving very slowly through the phases, I think constantly trying to find highly motivating activities often is hard and a challenge. I would also throw out, and this isn't exactly part of the protocol, but I would also throw out, if you've got a kiddo who is struggling to pick up PECS, that does not mean that there shouldn't be other methods of communication that you're also using throughout the day. So let's say you're trying PECS at snack time, and maybe you're trying PECS during their speech and language window, but maybe still at circle time they have a kind of single button, like a single button voice output that allows them to participate in circle, or maybe there's another way that they're able to kind of say no and to protest. So I just want to put that out there, that just because you're trying to teach PECS doesn't mean that any other ways of teaching that student to communicate or providing them opportunities to communicate need to cease. So absolutely, I think as far as how long it takes, it really does depend on the kiddo.
In that fading of prompts, there's actually an Autism Internet module on an MPDC ASD module on prompting. So if you want some training for your staff on how to fade out prompts, we're really not going to get into that in too much depth now, but it's basically you're going from often kind of hand over hand. I know that pretty quickly sometimes you just have your hand on the student's elbow and guiding their hand to the picture icon once they've understood that that's something that they pick up and hand to someone, and maybe nudging that elbow a little bit so that the student is then following through and moving their hand towards the communicative partner. And then you're just barely even touching the student, and they're engaging in that. But you want to fade that out as quickly as you can, because you do not want that student to think that they have to wait for the person to touch them before they can pick it up.
Right.
So waiting is the key. I mean, teach. I know that we would work with staff and just count to 10 silently to yourself. And you saw that in that video, occasionally they would show the item and then they would either hide it really quickly and reintroduce it so that it kind of was new again, in a sense, in the vision of visual field of the student, which will then more likely elicit the student to kind of reach out. And again, there's no verbal interactions there. Good.
You can be verbal once that student has made the request. Oh, gummy bears. Yeah, you wanted gummy bears. Here's a gummy bear. Absolutely. You should name it. You should do all that kind of lovely, interactive, language-rich kind of moments. But it's prior to that you don't really want to ask.
And the reason, again, for that is because you want that to be spontaneous. You're not giving the direction for the student to ask for it, but you are talking to the student and acknowledging it after they have done that independently. Yep. So during phase one of the suggestions was rotating the communicative partner and the helper. And again, these are the trained staff working with the student. So these are going to be trained people that you're rotating in phase one. Yep. You're not really just grabbing peers or the art teacher or people that aren't directly involved in programming with the student right away, probably in phase one, unless you've trained them. So you could. Yep. But you really want to make sure that you're and the reason for that is just to make sure that the student, again, isn't thinking that they're only going to be able to do this with one person handing it to or one person prompting, those types of things.
That's right.
This is a couple just additional pieces that they have. This is pretty short. Some additional suggestions for phase one.
The objective in PECS is spontaneous communication, so the physical prompter must wait until the child has initiated by beginning to reach for the training item or the picture before providing physical guidance.
Yep.
If the child loses interest in the initial item, a second item and its corresponding picture are used.
Cocoa Puff.
It is important that a child learns to communicate with a variety of people, so the trainers should reverse roles or new trainers may be introduced. Training continues until the child independently picks up the picture, reaches to the communicative partner, and puts the picture into his hand without prompting or assistance.
It's a nice little kind of showing you kind of the end of phase one there. That student was able to pick up that picture, hand it to the communicative partner, and receive the item, and then you heard the teacher talking about, oh, great, thank you, here you go. So phase two, and really quick, I'm going to see if we have any questions currently. Are there prerequisite skills necessary before you would choose PECS, and what about cognitive developmental level? That's a question we have.
I think I would there are very few kiddos that I would try PECS with. I think that idea of learning the exchange is something that I would surely introduce to most students. I have had students who really take a long time to get the concept, and so I don't think it is necessarily going to work for each and every student, but I would have a hard time saying that a student not be introduced to it, because they don't even need to be able to discriminate to begin. You're going to teach them how to discriminate between pictures and between objects along the way. So it really is just kind of shaping that reach into something that's more skillful. So I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but I think for most kids it can at least be introduced.
So in phase two, we're looking at increasing students' spontaneous independent engagement using pictures across people, settings, picture symbols. You're balancing, rotating the type of requests, so you want to make sure that you're not just using all food. You want to use activities, you want to use toys, you want to use books. You want to use still preferred items, but you want to balance that across the categories of preferred items. And here's what phase two is going to look like.
After successfully completing the first phase of PECS, phase two involves the communicative partner moving further away from the child, requiring more effort on the child's part to communicate. Initially, the communicative partner backs away from the child as the child reaches for him, gradually encouraging the child to stand up to move toward the communicative partner.
Oh, you want the ball. It's so much fun.
As the exchange is completed, the student is rewarded for her efforts by being given what she wants. She is also praised by the communicative partner.
My turn.
If the student is reluctant to stand up to move toward the communicative partner, but shows a continued interest in the item, it is the physical prompter who helps the student move.
Oh, ball.
As the child progresses, the trainer can arrange a greater distance between the child and the picture. Eventually, the book can be a great distance away, but its placement should not hinder communication.
Oh, you want chocolate.
Remember, the goal of Phase 2 is to teach the child to communicate with a variety of people, in different settings, and for a variety of items.
It's the train! You want the train!
All right. So pretty simple. You're just basically working off that student's spontaneously initiating and moving away from that student, so they're traveling to you, using different people, starting to work with different communicative partners, doing it in different parts of the building, maybe introducing it at home as well, and it's pretty, pretty general there. It is important also, you still have that helper partner if needed during Phase 2. So you need to make sure if you're scheduling that you have someone available to help the student in those situations. So if you move the book farther away, you have the helper there as well to assist with the prompting.
Yep, still purposeful teaching time, which I think you see in that video clip. That it's not kind of on the fly and it's not kind of catch as catch can, but it's more like this is when we're working with PECS right now. I love Phase 2. I love teaching that student to find me. I love teaching that student to go get their own book. Oh my gosh, what a powerful thing. I mean, for them to be able to go and seek out their words. Go find your book. You don't tell them that. But to teach them that skill is so powerful, as opposed to what we often do, right? Which is just put what that student needs right in front of them, put it right in front of them, tell them what to do with it, and then when it's not there, they've utterly lost that skill. So I love Phase 2.
They talk about the questioning look. So again, if the student is not reaching over to that PECS symbol, and again, you're using one symbol, you may have a whole bunch of symbols in the book, or in another location, but you have one symbol out in front of the student, or that the student has to travel to that symbol and pick it up off the book, and you're using that symbol on the communication book. That's something else we should probably point out. It's typically so that if they're carrying it with them, they know that they can go to their book.
Yep.
All right. And you are going to want to have many opportunities to practice. I know one of the things they talked about, you do have to remember if you're using the same object 20 times, you might see the student not engage.
Right.
You want to switch out the high preferred objects that you're introducing and the student is looking at across the day. Phase 3, stimulus discrimination between pictures. So this is kind of a fun phase. So this is, someone asked about that developmental levels for students. Even if students can't discriminate pictures in Phase 1 and 2, you just have one picture symbol out. This is when you start to introduce more than one picture symbol, starting with 2, and the student just has to discriminate, meaning they're going to have to choose what this higher preferred item is.
And we're going to teach them to do that. They don't even have to do it right away. We're going to teach them about that.
That's right. You're going to start out with one picture of the preferred item and the other picture of a non-preferred or irrelevant item. So here's an example that I kind of made up really quick. Let's say Jeremy really loves toy cars. He's never shown an interest in a plastic spoon. The teacher creates PECS symbols for a toy car and a plastic spoon. They're both placed on the PECS communication board or binder or book. Both items are within eyesight of Jeremy, so he can see the plastic spoon, he can see the actual toy car, he can also see both of those picture symbols that are in front of him on the PECS book, and he's going to pick up, this is an example of a successful discrimination. Jeremy picks up the car picture, not the spoon picture, and hands it to the teacher, who then says, "You want the car," and gives him the car. Here's a video to give you kind of an additional example of what this discrimination training looks like.
This is the beginning of what is called discrimination training. The goal of discrimination training remains teaching the difference between pictures or symbols of items that are equally reinforcing. In this training, pictures are gradually and systematically placed in the child's communication book. Discrimination training is best begun with the introduction of a preferred and non-preferred object. The communicative partner has arranged a situation in which the child is likely to ask for a particular item. Here, the child will most likely prefer the ball. With the ball in view and with no verbal prompts, the communication book has 2 pictures on it.
You want the ball.
One picture is of the ball, the other of a non-preferred or neutral object, such as a laundry scoop. If the child gives the communicative partner the picture of the ball, he will receive the ball after the picture exchange. If the child gives the other picture to the communicative partner, the trainer gives that item to the child.
So an important piece of this step, as Ellen said, we're teaching that student to pick the item. So if the student picks up the picture of the spoon, and you know that the student typically likes the car, you don't say no, you don't say anything, you just give them the spoon. In that example, when the student picked up the laundry scoop, then you said, oh, the laundry scoop, and you give them the laundry scoop. And that way the student is learning, okay, that's what I asked, that's what I get. So it is important just to make sure that you are using those highly preferred items when pairing the not preferred with the non-preferred item. So it's going to really help them with those discriminations. The other piece of this, so, they do give some suggestions, and I know the Pyramid Group has, in their materials, has a whole section on what to do if you're having difficulty with discriminations. These are some of the ones out of the MPD-CASD step-by-step instructions. You can make the picture of the preferred symbol larger, consider using colored pictures for preferred and black and white for the non-preferred, using highlighters, putting borders around the preferred item versus the non-preferred. You can make things three-dimensional simply by putting them on top of a block, put desired picture closer to the desired item. So those are just a few things that may help with discrimination training.
The other piece that I don't think we've highlighted in the PowerPoint here, but I think does send us back to that idea of someone being formally trained, is there's also some pretty detailed things on what to do as far as error correction kinds of things. So when the student does pick a picture that you know isn't what they actually want, there are kind of pretty methodical things you do before you reset. So that's something to keep in mind too.
So once the student is making those discriminations, that's when you can add additional pictures where they have to pick from a group of pictures. So those are a couple of pieces there. And you want to, one of the suggestions was to make sure to implement phase 3 in a structured environment because you are teaching a new skill, which is discrimination. So you want to do that in a more structured environment, and then you can start generalizing that to other environments once they're able to make those discriminations. Another piece of discrimination is correspondence checks. A correspondence check is used to check for understanding once a student consistently selects a preferred item. So basically, all this is once the student is handing you the picture of what they want, you hold up both items and see if they pick the one that they had requested.
You say, take it.
Yep.
Oh, okay, go ahead, take it. And so you make sure that they are grabbing what they asked for.
Exactly. Remember, the goal for phase 3 is that the student is selecting a preferred object, activity, food, picture from a group of pictures. You're still working on traveling to the communicative partner once you have that discrimination and handing the partner the picture to attain the object, activity, or food, and increasing that number of communicative partners, settings, activities, and pictures. So you can continue to work on what you were doing in phase 2 as you get the discrimination happening in phase 3. There's still no verbal prompts asking what do you want. We're still focusing on spontaneous communication. We don't want to get that student thinking that they have to wait for the teacher to say what do you want. You want them to be initiating. That's the big thing in this PECS protocol, is getting students to spontaneously initiate. So you're still not using that what do you want.
You also, though, don't need to be sitting there flat, which I see a lot, just kind of sitting there waiting with flat affect. You absolutely can be putting on a show and just like, this is just so fabulous, or you can be talking to colleagues, or you can be talking to other children and passing out whatever that object is to other children at the same time. You want to make it look awesome. You want them to be involved.
You want to make sure that you're not saying no. It's so hard for us not to say no when we know the student is choosing something that we don't think they're choosing. You just give them the object that they chose for, even if it's not the preferred item. So you want to eliminate saying no if they make an error, if you think they've made an error in the discrimination. And throughout this, you should be taking data. We're going to talk about data at the end, but Pyramid Group has some data sheets. There's other protocols, and there's things that you can look at in trainings that they share about ways to take data. But you want to be taking data on spontaneous communications, number of partners, the level of prompting, whether they need full prompting or if they're doing it independently or partial. So there's different ways of taking data there. Phase 4 is when you start introducing the I want symbol in front of one of the already mastered picture symbols the student's using. So if the student already is able to request a koosh ball and picking up a koosh ball picture from a group of pictures, is able to discriminate, hands it to the communicative partner says koosh ball, we're going to introduce sentence structure, and we'll see kind of what that looks like here now.
Another critical skill involves teaching the child to use simple sentences. This is introduced in Phase 4. A sequence of pictures is placed upon a sentence strip.
I want juice. There you go.
So you saw there that the student put the picture card on a sentence strip that had I want, handed it to the communicative partner, and the communicative partner said, I want, and then said juice.
And you are there starting to see that communicative partner really kind of just trying to pave the way for that student to move towards verbal communication. So you saw that, the pausing and the emphasis and all of that. The other piece that is good to know that I'm not sure that we have in here at all is the PECS folks also say you should always respond to a verbal attempt. So if you have pictures out in front of that kiddo asking for a koosh ball and he says ba and he makes a verbal approximation, you can go ahead and reinforce that. So that's something to keep in mind too, that we don't need this poor kiddo saying like ba, 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 and then we're waiting for that picture exchange, that we should absolutely reinforce, oh, you want the ball? I heard you say you want the ball. There it is. So.
Exactly. Similarly, in our case study where it sounded like the little girl Alex, even though she started out in maybe phase 1 or 2, she knew where those other picture symbols were and were finding them and using them independently. They didn't hold her back. If they are using a more skillful level of communication than what you are teaching, you want to reinforce that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So there is that sentence strip. It starts out with the sentence strip already has the I want symbol on there, and the student's just adding the picture symbol next to the I want symbol. And this is just some pictures of what those picture strips look like. They have Velcro on them to be put on there. And they have Velcro on the back. There's a nice little picture I found online.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah. Building sentence. So when you're building it, the helpers, you may need a helper to assist to help that student. Again, this is where the helper may still be needed for a brief amount of time or for whatever amount of time the helper is needed to help get that student kind of errorless teaching, making sure that they're putting it in the appropriate place if needed on the sentence strip. The communicative partner, again, is going to say that I want name of objects as soon as they get that. And we're going to show a clip where they show that pausing that elicits that verbal response from the student or helps to elicit. Over time, you're fading out that physical assistance, and eventually the student is picking up the I want symbol and the picture symbol, putting them both on the sentence strip and handing them. So that I want symbol will kind of be in the corner of the PECS book. They're pulling it off of there, and then they're pulling off the appropriate picture, and they're handing it to the teacher. All right. And again, as we had mentioned, any vocalization of attempt by the student should be reinforced and praised immediately. All right. There's still no vote. Again, we're spontaneous communication, so you're still not asking the student, what do you want? The student is just saying, using the extra icon for the I want and putting the picture with them. And you can continue those correspondence checks as well. All right. So let's look at phase 5. So phase 5 is the first time that the student is responding to the prompt of what do you want. So the goal of phase 5 is for the student to answer the question, what do you want? So they've already had many, probably hundreds of instances of practicing the spontaneous communication. Once you have that solid, you're ready to move into asking the question, what do you want? And they should be able to already be able to request spontaneously a lot of different preferences. So let's take a look at what that looks like.
After a child is taught to request using the sentence form, in phase 5, she is then taught to answer the simple question, what do you want?
What do you want? I want
car.
Car. Good.
The teacher used the sentence strip to provide a complete verbal model. He also paused in the midst of the sentence because this encouraged the child to complete the sentence or imitate what she had heard. Of course, the child was not forced to imitate.
I think that's one of my favorite clips because that skill right there is one of the things that we talked about, how you could incorporate that in so many, that pause, eliciting verbalizations, that can be used in a lot of other types of interventions that you're working with students. So that was the time delay right there. That's a 0-second time delay. So you're immediately asking that student. So when the student, so this strategy, when the student's pointing to that symbol, you're asking, what do you want? The student follows through with moving the I want symbol and selecting a picture to put in the sentence board. All right. And you're gradually increasing the amount of time between asking, what do you want, and pointing the symbol.
Right.
So
At first, you want to, you want to prompt that student. And this is without a helper. This is prompting that student so they start to partner very quickly. I hear what do I want, I answer the question. I hear what do I want, I answer the question. Because if we give them a ton of pause time, what do you want, and then pause, and wait, then they don't start to associate the question with the answer. So you are going to help that student move very quickly through that process. And then this slide talks about then you gradually start stretching that time out a little bit.
And I'll move into phase 6 as we're doing this. So this is the last phase, and this is on commenting. And this is actually the piece that I think is huge and opens the doors to a lot of inclusive opportunities in circle time, in sharing stories, so many things. And this is a big piece. And commenting is just basically naming things, labeling things, stating what is seen, what is heard, and it could also be useful skills, and we're talking about spontaneous commenting here as well. And this is a difficult skill for some students with autism to master. So let's take a look at what that looks at, and this is our last video here.
Another critical communication skill involves commenting about things rather than requesting them. For many children with autism, this is a difficult task. In phase 6, we can use the sentence structure and our previous strategies to encourage children to learn to comment.
You see a stamp.
Notice that the child was not given the stamp since he said he saw the stamp and did not ask for it. Over time, children are taught the difference between I see and I want.
And that's pretty much it. And they kind of summarize that quick, but this is probably one of the more challenging phases to implement.
Yeah, and I think the reality, and I think many of us who have used PECS know that it's not real common for kids to get to phase 6 with PECS. A couple of things happen. Either kids kind of get to a certain level and they stay there and you don't see them kind of able to move more independently into new phases, or they become verbal communicators, and then as an SLP or a school team, you may be working with that student in other ways to expand communicative functions and to talk about how do you comment, how do you label, how do you describe, how do you greet, how do you protest, all those other kinds of functions. So many times that's what you see happen. So I think phase 6 for PECS is one that many of us have less experience with, and I think can be challenging for kids on the spectrum, because you got to make it worth their while. Sometimes that's tricky.
So you're going to prepare for phase 6. You're going to collect those picture symbols and the actual physical items, 4 items the student is able to request. They do recommend not requesting the highly preferred items because that may make it a little easier for the student, because if you have their favorite thing and you're asking them to see it and they're not familiar with that concept, they're more likely to get frustrated if they don't get it. You're also making sure that the student is used to using PECS to request I want and receiving an item. So you need to just remember that this is going to be new for that student.
Can I just go back just a little? No, you can stay on the slide, but what I was just saying about kind of kids may or may not getting to the phase 6. The other piece that I think is becoming, again, when we talk about other devices that are out there, like an iPad or a different speech generating device, the other thing to keep in mind is once kids are really using their PECS system very fluidly and easily and spontaneously, as that book of pictures expands and expands and expands, I do think that we are at the point now with technology where at some point we say, wow, it's awfully silly for this kiddo to be walking around with this gigantic binder, and half the time the picture he wants isn't in there anyway. And at some point we may want to transition to a more efficient device. So that's the other piece that might kind of get in the way of getting to phase 6, because you're talking about a student frequently who has kind of a high skill level with the system, and you might have decided as a team, with the family, everybody on the same page about kind of where you're going to go next.
And we had a question, during early stages, what would you recommend if a child selects one of 2 pictures to request an item, but once the item's given, the child rejects the item, maybe even throwing it? So you definitely want to continue to respect the request, and if that's what they're requesting, because that's how they're learning that when I give you this, this is what I get.
So I'm assuming that means, so you have him requesting between, let's say, a cookie and some broccoli, and you're expecting that cookie to be the preferred item, and they choose the broccoli picture, and you say, oh, broccoli, and you give them the broccoli, and they get awfully ticked off with you. And that can certainly happen. So a couple things can happen. You may want to pick something that's more neutral than broccoli. So it's not a cookie, but it's maybe, like Daniel was saying, a scoop or a spoon or something kind of just boring. That can help. The other piece in there that I had mentioned was that idea of error correction. So sometimes what you do, and I'm not going to be really good about pulling up exactly the perfect method to do this, but sometimes when that happens, you have the student become very successful at something not related to that original task. So something like, touch your nose, great job, move on. And so that error correction kind of practice in there sometimes breaks up that momentum of, shoot, that didn't go the way I wanted to, and kind of gets you back on track a little bit. So yeah, and then I would say if that less preferred object or kind of that more neutral object continues to become pretty stressful, then I would maybe switch it all up and find a different highly reinforcing thing, and maybe it's somehow less reinforcing than the other one, but still awesome. I mean, I think there are ways you can play around with that.
Yeah. It also depends on the amount of time. If that happens right away, that's going to happen. The student's learning that. But if that's happening and you're doing that phase for weeks, that's when you need to kind of maybe adjust those items. think about, is the student wanting, is there something about throwing the item that is actually reinforcing for the student? And then maybe just eliminating if it's a set of items that are like that, eliminating that class of items. So there could be a couple different ways to look at it. So with this phase 6, it is important to remember that once that student hands everything over, the communicative partner is saying, yes, you see the item, and providing that praise and reinforcement, but you're not giving that item like you were in the I want, because the student is seeing it. And they're learning the difference then between I want and I see. There was a really nice example of that pause and waiting. So you could say, I see, and then pausing, and the student waiting for the student to pick up the picture symbol of the physical item. All right. I'm going to kind of move into, once they're consistently picking up the I see and they're able to do that, that's when you start kind of doing some discrimination training. And you do it similar to stage 3 with the I want. So you are putting 2 pictures. So you might be showing the student a spoon, and you have a picture of a spoon and a ball, and the ball is nowhere in sight, but the spoon is right there in your hand. And the student is then initiating I see and then the spoon. And then once the student learns what do you see, that's when, once they consistently can be naming different objects and what they see, you can then start kind of alternating what do you want and what do you see. Ellen, do you have any advice? So you don't want to probably totally give up on working on what do you want, but you also don't want to confuse the student when you're working on what do you see. Do you just stop working on what do you want, or do you go maybe to schedule them at different times of the day, or separate them in some location or temporary?
I think that if you have a kiddo who's at phase 6, they get it. They get it. You know what I mean? They're pretty bright. They're figuring this out. They know the system. So I think typically, I think you would work on exclusively working on what do you see, what do you see, what do you see. And if you see that student not necessarily having a lot of success with that, then you might want to go back, right? Go back to phase 5 and be working more on what do you want that way. And then you start going back and forth. But again, if you've got a student who's at phase 6, they're understanding communication. And at this point, they're that idea of kind of doing what do you see, I also think it depends. You know, I mean, I think if you're working with a high schooler, it's different than if you're working with a little early childhood kiddo. You know, I think it just kind of depends where they are as far as their ability to function in their, you know, in their world. So, but I would say if they're not getting what do you see, always in PECS, I say it's okay, take a step back. If they're not getting it, take a step back. Go back to where they were having success.
So a great outcome of phase 6, and I think that's really creative. You know, you have the what do you want, what do you see, but you can also work on what do you hear and what do you have. So you can use different sounds. You can do all kinds of creative things at that point. And you're wanting that student to spontaneously comment without being asked. You know, that can be difficult. So some of the suggestions were just create engaging and interesting activities. So the student walks into their activity area at the table, and there's something they know, like maybe a dinosaur, and they've already wanted the dinosaur, but they've never seen it in that location, or it's a new type of dinosaur, and it's laying on the table, or it's in the corner, or it's up in the corner hanging from the ceiling, or something like that, where they can make those comments and spontaneous communications.
You know, and I think the other thing, when I think about working with our students on the spectrum, and it's interesting to know, too, that PECS is not exclusive for students on the autism spectrum by any stretch. And so when I think about our kids on the spectrum and some of the things that we're really asking them to comment on, a lot of times it's commenting on kind of their own systems. So if you think about, it would be interesting, if anyone is doing this, please shoot me an email because I want to know about it. It would be interesting to take a kiddo who's at phase 6 PECS and overlay that with something like zones of regulation, and having them comment on kind of what zone they're in. You know, I feel red, I feel blue. Those kinds of pieces. I think when we think about what communication we're encouraging of our kids, that's a lot of what we're asking them to do.
I know that I did a lot of these with students, and I've done this both with students with sign language or with other communication devices and PECS, where we would just get engaging books, walking down the hallway at school, because there's always new teachers that are putting new displays out, and we would just stop. I did a lot of that stopping and expecting looks to elicit some communication, and occasionally even kind of going, you walk down the hallway to the water fountain and you stop and give the expected look prompt, but then on your way back, just a few minutes later, you have another opportunity and you kind of fade that out a little bit to try to get the student to do some more of that spontaneous communication. And I've had some good success of teaching students who really did not initiate much at all, getting them to do some spontaneous communications. The only mistake I made was I did that with the student, so she would do it with me, but then when I talked to the other people working with her, she wasn't doing it with them. So that generalization piece is huge in sharing what the strategies you're using. There's basically in next steps, you're using that communication books in a lot of different ways. You're expanding use of picture symbols, working on verbalizations, working with multiple people. Some people get really creative with sentence structure and adding proper nouns, adjectives, verbs, pronouns, so that students are literally being able to say, I want the blue dinosaur that's on the shelf.
And I think without question, I would say those descriptor words and those pieces, I want the big block, the little block, the red dragon, for lots of different reasons. I think that would be an exciting, if you get a kiddo to phase 6, you certainly want to go that kind of concept vocabulary, I think, is huge.
And if you have kids that are quickly moving to phase 6 and have good abilities there, you will be amazed at the level of vocabulary they're able to create.
Again, I love PECS. If you've got a kiddo who's at that point, I think probably you should be moving to a speech-generating device. Yeah. I will say that. Yeah. I think that the limitations of kind of pulling off different pictures is such that we are beyond that at this point, so I certainly want to put that out there.
Definitely. All right. So we haven't talked much about data collection. Do you have any big tips? It's very important to make sure that you are collecting that data, sharing with families, being objective in your data collection. You're collecting data on independence and on teacher prompting, the number of times that the student is able to practice each day, the results of that. Any major suggestions?
Well, a couple things. Number one, well, that's convenient. There's 2 of you, right? You've got 2 adults. You have to have them anyway. Somebody may as well take data. So that's a nice piece. And then the other one is just that I think that idea of moving through the phases somewhat methodically and not just saying, oh, we know he's got it. Oh, we know he's got it. Oh, he can do it. But that idea of really having some numbers in front of you that say, yeah, you know what, I know he can do it, because yesterday he did it with 80% independence at snack time, and today he did it with 85% independence at art, and so that you can say it's how we're ready to move up. Again, just being really mindful about kind of where you're at in those stages.
And I would not only take the data on those student outcomes, but look at that fidelity. Check those step-by-step instructions, go back to training that you may have had from the pyramid group, PECS trainers, finding out, revisiting, are you implementing all the phases? If you're stuck at a phase, go back and reteach. You may have to go back at times. Couple big ideas here. You really are going to start out better with that reinforcement sampling and reinforcement inventory. The sampling, as Ellen said, can be a lot of fun, and it's pretty simple. You just collect those objects and do that sampling and really make sure that you're thinking of time of day and satiation and those types of things as well. You want to make sure that if you're using PECS, if you say you're using PECS, make sure you're using the protocols. Make sure that you're trained. Make sure that you're using it as a communication system. It's okay to use visual supports and to use picture symbols for all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
Visual schedules, please do that. You should be, definitely. But that's not PECS.
Call PECS PECS.
Yeah, call PECS PECS. There we go. And following that PECS protocol, ensuring appropriate staff training is very important. Consider using pictures of some tips. Sometimes it is helpful to use those pictures of actual objects or people. once they're communicating independently, you want to be looking at that data on prompted versus independent use of PECS, and moving along to the appropriate steps as you move along. Some people like to organize their communication books by vocabulary categories. So once you have students that are able to request a lot of different I wants, you could have a page for food and a page for toys and a page for the different computer programs the student uses, or free time or places or people that they go to. Other times people organize them by times a day. So here's all the pictures for circle time. Here's the pictures for seat activities. Here's the pictures when you're in art class. So just kind of sit down as a team and kind of figure out what system works best for you. Some people like to just kind of keep track of the vocabulary. That's another data piece that you could have, is just so people know what the student is capable of communicating. Some people set IEP goals around number of variety of use of vocabulary. And think about, using binders, books, sheets, whichever kind of works best for that student. So when allowed in the PECS protocol, and also throughout it, it's always building on pictures, people, places, settings. Right. And then the final piece here is just kind of connecting families to that PECS process. So if there's any questions, we're kind of finishing up. A few people made some comments that they're kind of excited about this process. I definitely, with the working with families, you definitely want to be kind of working with families, and that Autism Internet module is a great way to intersect families, to know what you're doing. It's free. They have, as I mentioned, it's something, PECS is a practice that is used at home often as well. So definitely something that you can assist families with. If you end up getting any of the materials or videos from the Pyramid group, you can share those and check them out to families so they have an idea of what it looks like. Sharing video of intervention at school, those are all some ideas. Just kind of point out as we round out in the next minute here, the PECS training kind of falls in line with Wisconsin's Guiding Principles for Teaching and Learning, and you can kind of look at that there. I will say that some of you are using the Danielson framework as part of the educator effectiveness. I would just encourage you that if you look at some of those domains, there's a lot of correlations with some of these domains in terms of managing student behavior, classroom environment, definitely under instruction, engaging students. That reinforcement sampling and inventories is a type of assessment that informs your instruction. So there's some possible look-fors if you're working with those really tough students. Sometimes teachers don't know, like, how do I show I'm making progress with some of these students that have a lot of communicative difficulties. So take a look, talk to your administrators, and see if there might be some look-fors in implementing PECS if you can get further training. Certainly, this would kind of fall in line with pretty intensive positive behavior intervention support and teaching more skillful behavior. And then finally, I have the link here to some of the Pyramid Education Consultants resources. They have 2 trainings coming up in Wisconsin for PECS Level 1 in Eau Claire and Milwaukee, September, November, respectively. There's a few, if you could make sure to take that follow-up survey, that will be helpful. Thank you, Ellen, for your time today. Thank you for your guidance and suggestions and comments. It's been fun.
Yep. Thank you.
I look forward to next school year with you. Everyone, thank you so much for helping. If you have any final questions, we'll kind of hold on and maybe answer those for you. But otherwise, thank you and goodbye.